Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Hugh Taylor from Akana. Welcome to Driving Digital Innovation with a Layered API Design Approach with Randy Heffner from Forrester and our CTO, Alistair Farquharson. We're going to get started in just 1 second. A couple of quick maintenance notes. We are going to be distributing a link to a recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint deck in a couple of days. So if you miss anything, you can always come back to it there. We ask that you mute your line by pressing *6. We're going to have Q&A at the end. Please go ahead and enter any questions you have for our panelists into the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, or into the chat, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to turn this over to Randy Heffner, who's going to lead off with us here.
Very good. Thank you. Let me
just share your screen, Randy.
Actually, I need to just share an application that works better for the way that we do this. And so my apologies. My computer is just adjusting while I tries to get the share going. And so there. So it should be sharing now. Just confirm that for me, just to make sure.
Yeah, looks good. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So sorry. So yeah, so I'm kicking off as a guest speaker for Akana, and afterwards, Alistair. So in my remarks, what I want to do is lead up to helping you understand why a layered API design approach is critical for your API strategy, and a key part of that is understanding that bit API strategy. Well, what is your API strategy? And we need to spend a fair bit of time actually sort of expanding the picture of what is API strategy and what does that do? What aspects of API strategy will you have? And the reason that that's important is because there are a lot of small views of API strategy out there, and we need to expand your view to a bigger view of API strategy so that you'll have a clear and intuitive understanding of why layered APIs are important. So the first sort of way that API strategy gets sort of compartmentalized is it gets thought of as being for mobile. We got to do APIs because we're doing mobile, and there's all sorts of industry headlines and such out there saying that APIs are for mobile. Well, they're great. The thing is, APIs enable much more than mobile, and so that's a critical thing to understand and know as you are considering APIs and how you might design your APIs. So let's talk about that. So okay, APIs for mobile, but they actually get pretty strategic to your business and to the future of your business. But let's walk up to that. So you got mobile, okay, you understand that, but you also need to do web applications are still out there, or kiosk, or serve your customers from call centers or smartwatches or whatever the touch point might be, digital TVs. In other words, you need APIs to be a foundation for a multi-touch point strategy, multi-touch point applications and multi ways of serving customers, serving employees, working with business partners. There's a lot that just centers around interaction channels like mobile, but it goes beyond that. You might need to serve open web developers. Maybe you have an open web strategy that could be similar to the likes of what a Google or Facebook do on the one hand, but also Brooklyn Museum or Chicago Transit Authority or Transport for London, where all of these have open web API strategies and ways that they reach customers, channels, partners better because of the ability to develop a broad set of developers around their business, their markets, their opportunities, their channels. So it goes farther than that to just a core focus on enterprise agility. And here we touch an important theme, something that's always been important in service-oriented architecture. And I won't get into the religion of APIs versus SOA, except to say that SOA is still important and still good, and if you're thinking about SOA the right way. But so there's a core enterprise agility to be able to do new processes, customer process optimization, optimize value chain through B2B connections and such. So these are core value propositions that tie to APIs. And actually, although open web APIs and maybe mobile are sort of the big conversations in how APIs are changing business, actually there's more going on with B2B APIs, and so that's a very important aspect of considering the future for your APIs. So then beyond that, it gets even more strategic because APIs can help you enter completely new markets. Consider a car repair firm that gets a lot of data of what it takes to repair cars, and maybe they then can sell that data not to their current customers, people like you and me who go get your car repaired, but to brand new markets, brand new customers of insurance companies, auto firms, maybe others. So they can turn a hidden asset into a product. And maybe connect products to whole new kinds of ecosystems, or have some core capability, something that you become good at as an organization that you are then able to sell into new customers, turn into a product, maybe even serve competitors. And we'll get into one of these examples in a minute. But let me give you a way to think about this sort of new opportunities for business and how to think about how APIs can prepare your organization for new opportunities for business. So in a traditional sort of business model, you start out by thinking, well, what business are we in? Or, do we make cars? Do we make farm equipment? Are we a bank? Are we an insurance company? What are we? And then who are our customers? What channels are we going to reach them through? Direct sales or agents or whatever. What partners do we need? And then maybe you start thinking about how you make your supply chain more efficient through some means of external integration. In an open business model, the starting point is understanding your assets and competencies. What are you good at? What are the things that you are uniquely good at? Where is your unique value? And understanding that maybe you have a value proposition like an health insurance company where you do claims and underwriting and a number of other related services. And maybe like the health insurance industry, you find you are being disaggregated or unbundled, where sometimes you're being asked to sell individual pieces of what you thought was a bundled service. Or what is sometimes more likely to happen is what happened to Yahoo with Google. Yahoo was this one big portal with search and everything, and Google came along and said, I'm better at search, I'm going to do search. And took that a whole lot of focus away from Yahoo because they were good at one particular thing, and they'd become good at other things as well. But when you start by understanding your competencies, you ask a different set of questions. You say, well, what ecosystems need the things that we're good at and the individual things that we're good at? What kind of relationships does it take to get us into those ecosystems? And it might not be by going after potential customers directly. Maybe the key relationships are with influencers who then get you into your customers, and then you can be focused on your customers. So it's about what connections enable those relationships and how do you leverage those connections and those relationships. The point is, where design for internal integration or external integration begins is at the whole other end of the spectrum. You need to be able to think about and understand, how will my competencies, the things I'm good at, how can I connect those into new ecosystems, new opportunities? So let's talk about a bank that's thinking this way. There's this European bank, and the CIO there, I love the way he thinks. He says, if we don't disrupt our own business, someone else will. Out of the blue. It will be Yahoo, and Google will take away a piece of our business. And so a particular way that the example of how that comes off is they have a trading platform, and they white label their trading platform, basically rebrand their website, their user experience into that trading platform. They've done that for a while, and that's not such a surprising business model, but they felt pressure from customers who wanted to do new things, either add functions to that experience or do their own experience. So they opened up APIs into the trading platform so that now those institutional customers can use just the trading platform. They are unbundling their own business in that way, and that leads to a series of shifts in how they think and the business possibilities. So they're able now to turn a core business capability into a revenue source, their trading platform. Then that decouples innovation by the bank and its customers. So if an institutional customer comes up with a great new way to do the user interface for a trading platform, then they can do that, and the bank wins from that innovation because they're going to be using more of the bank's product because they're getting more customers through their own innovation. So that gives rise to questions, well, which is the key value add? Is it for the bank? Is it their trading platform, or is it their user experience, or it's both? Or is something else going to be unbundled from these in the future? Is a piece of the trading platform going to get unbundled in the future? Well, so their strategy then, and here's where they really have understood and adopted this notion of digital disruption and API-enabled core business strategy, is they craft loosely coupled strategies for each asset and capability, and they're API-enabling more and more of them so that they can disrupt the market when it's possible, or if they get disrupted, they can react more quickly because it's their core business capabilities that are API-enabled. So with that, let's talk about 4 different ways. I mentioned a couple of different ways, your kinds of APIs, but you need to understand even more about them, and so we'll walk through this quickly. There's open web APIs. I mentioned those, like the Google and Facebook. You'll get thousands of developers. B2B APIs, which is a bit closer to what what this bank is doing with their trading platform. And then there are internal APIs, which some think of internal APIs as like SOA strategy, but again, don't get caught up in that. We've been doing external integration with SOA for years, but it's when you're using your own internal APIs, and you may be those open web and B2B APIs may be the same APIs that as you're using internally, just with different policies applied. You may see these 3 discussed in the industry as public, partner, and private APIs. I like these terms because I think they're more descriptive. But the other one that I don't hear talked about much in the industry is product APIs. So let me describe this a little bit more, because I think it's a very important angle into thinking about new opportunities and possibilities. So product API is there to directly control a product or to facilitate integrating that product into an ecosystem of related products. And it could be a physical product, a digital product, hardware, software, it could be service, could be any of those. But let me give you an example to help drive it home. Via one of the other kinds of APIs, you might reserve a hotel room. With a product API, you might control the hotel room itself. Turn on the lights, turn on parental controls on the TV. If it's a business room, lock and unlock doors for when people are supposed to be able to get into different parts of your conference or whatever it might be. So you're controlling the product itself or integrating it. But you should think about anything can be a product API, because any product or service you have either is already digital, already can have a digital interface, or it can have a digital proxy. Think of a digital proxy as, for example, at a public transit stop, there may be a little sign with a code posted that's the code, the digital code for that stop, and you put that into a mobile app and it tells you when the next bus is coming. Well, the bus stop is not digital, but it has a digital proxy that brings it into the digital world. So product APIs, another kind of important aspect. Okay, so now let's start to build toward the layered API strategy. What you see is that these different kinds of APIs have varied success factors. If you're doing an API for a single touch point, which you may need, and Android and iOS do data synchronization differently, so native mobile apps to those devices will need to have different APIs or different implementations. But here you're trying to very much collaborate, get an engaging user experience, between your API and the device, and allow many different paths through the interface. An API that's serving a multi-touch point strategy needs to have familiarity across many different touch points, plus allowing individual touch points to vary when it's appropriate. If you're trying to reach open web developers, then it's all about the business model, the motivations. Why would they use your API? Do they get paid to use your API, or do you pay them? I mean, do they pay or do you pay them? So what are the models? What are the applications? What are the scenarios? B2B, you may have much deeper needs for cross-organization process integrity and security federation and deeper kinds of more complex requirements that you could not make with an open web kind of scenario. And then enterprise agility. You're working with your own definitions of transactions and data, and you're trying to create portfolios of services for your domains, various business domains. And then product ecosystems. You've got a constantly shifting community of products. You may have strategic business relationships to support. So you have all these different factors that now get into the API layering story. So let's work first with the multi-touch point strategy and say, you got mobile, web, kiosks. You need consistent business results across all of those. And that's what a business API is about. Orders need to be processed the same way no matter where they originate. And then you need a layer of APIs that are specific to the touch points, and a layer of APIs that bring multi-touch point experience. And you may have additional, but I'm trying to present the broad picture here. So great, this is wonderful, but these business APIs don't serve only these multi-touch point strategy, so you need them to serve more context, such as B2B scenarios and partners and suppliers who may have some special business rules where orders still get processed the same, but there are additional functionality, additional things they might be able to do through the B2B API that are not available for consumers accessing through your mobile app. And then when you go into public developers and such, maybe there's, again, some specific business rules that layer on top of your core business, but then maybe there's some additional, more presentation layer kind of functionality for caching, security, other things that again, layer on top to provide some additional functionality and capabilities. So this is what I mean by a layered API strategy. Multiple layers, potentially adding functionality on top, potentially adapting and taking functionality and making it more specific or delivering it in a more efficient way to a particular channel. And as one enterprise, you may have many API user communities. So you've got some of these APIs that are more user experience oriented, some that are more business API oriented. You got open web developers, but maybe open web developers served by two different divisions. And so they have different, perhaps related API portfolios that they use. Many different B2B partners, and maybe some of those access via B2B processes. Maybe some partners are accessing APIs that are more related to doing product design and you're in an IoT world where you've got devices that have APIs and they need to design products to work with them. And then you've got your internal developers that are doing a variety of different kinds of APIs. So these many different communities fit in with the layered design and different kinds of strategies there as well. So let me finish off with some recommendations. Treat API strategy as business strategy. This out of the blue digital disruption, but that pretty much every organization needs to be prepared for. That demands business agility, and API-enabled business capabilities allow the rapid business reconfiguration that requires. Layered design helps you evolve a coherent application portfolio in and around your core API business strategy. So don't shortchange the importance of business APIs. Often I hear mobile needs APIs, and I don't hear anything about the consistency that's needed. It's across different channels. It's just give us an API. And portfolio management for your services this is a means into a lightweight governance to evolve a coherent portfolio where you know what layer of the API portfolio that it fits in, and you have coherent portfolios to serve different business purposes. And then finally, design your APIs around business scenarios and the users of those APIs. So that business scenarios drive business demands, business requirements, and your API users that are going to be using those determine how easy the API must be to use. APIs have to be very easy typically for open web developers, whereas the higher demands of B2B scenarios and requirements and potentially security federation and higher demands for process integrity may mean that your APIs there not only can be more complex, but actually have to be to handle the requirements. So it's the business scenarios and the API users that determine how your strategy will come off and how you'll design individual APIs. But in designing those APIs, think about layers, think about the taxonomy, the different kinds of APIs that you have, because not all APIs are the same, so you need a layered API design strategy. Alistair, I'll let you pick it up from there.
Thanks, Randy. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If you can just stop sharing. There we go. And I'm now the presenter.
And Alistair, can you go full screen, please?
How does that look?
Good.
All right. Thank you very much, Randy. So obviously we're dealing with layered APIs, and a lot of our customers actually deal with layered APIs because they have APIs at many different levels of their business. They have APIs for many different channels and many different audiences. So I'm going to talk briefly about the sort of core capabilities you need as an enterprise to actually manage these different kinds of APIs. If you look at an API platform in general, there are typically three high-level requirements or capabilities within an API platform. The first one is the portal, and that's the developer engagement experience. Where do people actually go and interact with these APIs? The second big component is the gateway. How do you do security and management and orchestration and mediation of these APIs at these different layers or between these different layers? And then last but not least is Lifecycle. How does API or the API platform affect your DevOps, your SDLC? How does it affect the integration and automation aspects of your organization as it exists today? So each one of these different things is going to be slightly different depending on what sort of level of that API layered approach you're at. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So first of all, the API portal. API portals provide things like search capabilities, documentation, licensing, partner management, user and application provisioning, federation capabilities, analytics, pretty flashing lights, nice charts, an engaging developer experience, whoever that developer might be. When you start looking at a layered approach to APIs, what you quickly realize is that you have different audiences. And no matter what kind of web experience you're putting together, you need to make sure that that web experience caters to that specific audience. So whether you're selling shoes or chewing gum, or whether you're putting APIs out there into the market, you need to be aware of who your audience is and design that user experience around that particular audience. And what that means fundamentally is that you have, because you have a different audience and because you have a different market, you're going to end up with different user experiences around perhaps a different number of APIs, or the security experience is going to be different, or workflow is going to be different. If you think about an internal set of APIs, as Randy put it, the sort of shared APIs at the bottom of the chart, there's going to be a large number of those APIs coming out of different applications within your organization. Or if you're looking at a B2B API strategy, you're probably going to have a fairly large number of APIs, maybe 10 or 20 or 30 APIs. At that point, your user experience is radically different from a consumer-facing API user experience, where you're going to limit the number of APIs to maybe 1 or 2 around a very, very sort of specific business experience. If you think about the Twitter API experience, Twitter has an API. Facebook has an API. They have one API. And the calls to action and the marketing and everything drives you to consuming that single API. But if you're looking at using APIs as building blocks in a layered approach, or if you're looking at a B2B kind of context, then you're going to immediately sort of center around a catalog approach or search-based approach. And it's going to fundamentally change that user experience. The difference between having one API or 100 APIs is a radically different user experience, a different marketing experience, and a different engagement experience. If your audience is external to your company versus internal, you're going to have a very, very different way of engaging with them. And you're going to have different security models. Externally, they're going to log in with Google. Internally, they're going to log in with the corporate LDAP. So these different audiences are essentially going to have a different kind of API portal with a different user experience. So when you think about these different audiences that you have within these different layers, whether they be internal or external or between partners, you have to think about how the number of APIs and the security and workflow and those kinds of things are going to affect that user experience, and design a user experience specific to that particular channel or that particular line of business or that particular set of partner relationships. You're also going to have to think about how the branding and the marketing of this particular API portal will change based on that. Your internal intranet branding is different from your external intranet branding, and it's a lot easier to brand something internally than having to work through your brand people and your marketing people to figure out what your consumer-facing brand should look like and how that integrates with your brand strategy as a corporation as a whole. So there are different considerations and there are different concerns when you are building a portal, an API portal, for internal versus external versus consumer-facing. And these things need to be taken into account. Most of our customers actually have different portals for different points within this layered approach. So they'll have an internal portal, they'll have a partner portal, and they'll have a consumer-facing portal. It all might come out of the same back-end infrastructure or architecture, but the way it's exposed and presented to their audiences is different. It's a different window into the same, or to a subset, or to a commonly shared set of APIs.
Alistair, we've had several comments that your voice is a little hard to hear. Can you speak a little louder, please?
I can try. I'm speaking quite loudly into the phone, so I will do so.
Thank you.
You're also going to have different providers. So when you are looking at APIs at these different lines of business or at these different layers, different groups or divisions or geographical regions are going to be providing different APIs. And if each one of these API providers needs their own infrastructure or wants their own portal, then you're going to need to figure out how to connect those different portals together and centralize that user experience. I have a use case at the end of this presentation that talks about this specifically, But if you just think about how an organization is structured, a large enterprise, they all have different, often very disconnected and independent lines of business. And each one of these teams is going to be going down an API management track. They have a singular focus to create a set of shared APIs, or to create a set of B2B APIs, or to create a set of consumer-facing APIs. And these groups might have different quality of service metrics, different technologies, different infrastructures, and different objectives around the APIs. At the end of the day, though, you want to actually manage that user experience for consuming those APIs. So you're going to have to figure out how to connect these things together. So learning how to federate the APIs, or to, for want of a better term, replicate the API metadata across these different portals is really important, because each layer is dependent on other layers. And each layer is going to be aggregating or consuming APIs from other layers. So you need to figure out how exactly you're going to federate these different departments together and get them to cooperate in an overall API architecture. Let's look at the gateway next. So the gateway provides a lot of different runtime capabilities like security, authentication, encryption, mediation, and whatnot. The API gateway is sort of where the rubber meets the road, where you're managing all of the non-functional requirements and orchestration and mediation of these different API calls. In my opinion, the API gateway should really be providing also the aggregation and orchestration of APIs between these different layers. So to steal one of Randy's diagrams in one of his last slides, you have these different APIs at different levels, business APIs, B2B APIs. You're developing touchpoint-specific APIs on top of multi-touchpoint experience APIs. And this is a capability that the gateway needs to bring. You need to be able to say, well, for this particular touchpoint, I only need the following, API subset. Or I need to aggregate these two API calls into one to make this mobile application perform better. So these are things that the gateway should be able to provide. And these are things that exist between these different layers. So you're going to have potentially different lines of business owning a gateway to aggregate the API calls from other lines of business. And that's why the federation is important, and that's why a single architecture or a single strategy is important across an organization. Let's look a little bit at Lifecycle. So each API layer, as I mentioned, is often owned by different people. So especially in a large organization, it's very, very easy if you're looking at a greenfield kind of organization, such as a startup. But with large enterprises, you're dealing with very, very different cultures. You have different development teams, different SDLCs, different technology processes, potentially different DevOps processes and tools that are being used. So you're going to have to figure out how you're going to control the dependencies during development and at runtime while still remaining agile. If you're going to be building APIs out of other APIs, how do you actually manage the life cycle of that API? How do you manage the software development process of the applications that are depending on these APIs? And how do you keep track of all of these dependencies that are now emerging between these different API tiers that are owned by different people with different SDLCs? So one of the examples that I spoke about earlier is a Resale Bank, and their business objective was to strengthen the relationship with the bank's partners. So they wanted to create a culture of innovation. They wanted to expose a set of APIs to the larger B2B community that they have, and they wanted to create a platform to automate the onboarding of these partners and to manage all of their B2B relationships. The issue at hand was that they had 4 different divisions that were exposing APIs. They had 2 departments, one that were both using Java and .NET with Oracle backend and ESBs and repositories. They had another department that was sort of TIBCO-centric, and another department that was a small Java shop but did not have an ESB. And each of these different departments or lines of business was politically or culturally a very, very sort of different organization. And this often happens in large enterprises as a result of mergers, or as a result of regulatory forces, or as a result of geography. So you always get these differences of opinion or differences of culture within an organization. And these are political barriers to creating a unified API strategy. What this organization wants to do, though, was they wanted to create a single branded API portal for their partners. But all of these APIs were coming out of different places. It's not really a good example of a layered approach, but it's more of an example of a federated approach. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to create, or they wanted to install or allow each department or line of business to own and operate their own API infrastructure. But they wanted those APIs to be presented into a consistent or into a single portal so that their partners had a common and controlled brand experience. So they would have these 4 departments. Each of these 4 departments would actually run their own infrastructure and their own portals. So at the departmental level, they're managing their own APIs and their own API lifecycle. But when those APIs are then aggregated up into externally facing APIs, at that point, they come into the purview of the single branded experience that this company wants to show to the outside world. So each company or each line of business owns and operates their own infrastructure and their own portal. But then there's this other single portal that's owned by a centralized group that presents a single brand for the APIs that are presented out into their channel. So going back to, say, this diagram over here, there's a lot of different these business APIs are divided up into different business units. But those B2B APIs, those are aggregates of those other APIs at a lower level and presented through a single unified brand. So there's a portal for each of those 3 or 4 departments at that lower level, and then there's another portal that's exposed to their B2B partners where those APIs get aggregated into and exposed to their partners. And that's the way that this company can actually manage that brand experience and determine their go-to-market strategy and actually basically write requirements for their B2B APIs down into the business API level. So in summary, as organizations sort of see this development of a layered API portfolio across different channels and lines of business, they really need to think about 3 things. They need to think about the user experience and how the audience and the providers within that architecture affect that user experience. And it's going to be affected by things like, who are you marketing to? What are the business requirements? What are you trying to achieve with this particular API channel? And then from a provider perspective, what sort of security requirements do you have? What sort of workflow requirements do you have? And those kinds of things. Tooling. You need to figure out how to manage, secure, and orchestrate the APIs in the portfolio. So whether you're using an API gateway from a vendor like ours or from another vendor, you need to figure out how exactly you're going to allow the different groups within these different layers to successfully orchestrate the APIs from the layer beneath them. So how they're going to take potentially very sort of specific APIs and turn that into a product API, or how they're going to take a business API and create a touchpoint API. So you need to create a platform on which people can orchestrate and mediate the different API calls together to provide that specific experience. And then how does this affect your SDLC and DevOps processes? Currently you have DevOps processes and you have SDLCs and you probably have more than one of each. How is this API strategy, how is this layered approach to APIs and all of these interdependencies going to affect and reflect on your SDLC process, and how are you going to track these things, and how are you going to manage change and different versioning strategies across these different layers of APIs or these different lines of business? And that's it. I think we'll open it up to questions. Hopefully everybody actually managed to hear me. So let's see. We have a couple of questions here. I'll mediate the questions, Randy, and send you some questions as well.
Great.
Okay, so let's see. How do you differentiate between federation versus orchestration on API workflow? To me, federation is about how do you actually replicate the metadata about the API between different portals. So there's two different concepts of federation. The one is around security, which is not applicable here. The federation I'm referring to is how does a business unit publish an API within their own business unit, and how does that then get federated out into maybe a different portal in a different business unit or with a different channel. So what we can do with our product, for example, is we can set up multiple portals and connect them all together so that they are sharing the same APIs. And this allows organizations to create an Uber API portal that has APIs from other API portals presented in it. And that's the kind of federation that I'm talking about here. Orchestration is all about how do you actually literally, when you have one API call coming in, how do you then say call APIs 1, 2, and 3 and aggregate the responses back from those 3 API calls into a single API call. So they're fundamentally kind of different concepts.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would add to that is just to help think through federation, that the key word is delegation. In a federated model, there's always something that is delegated from one level to another level, and in the case of a portal, and the Uber portal, to use Alistair's term, the Uber portal is delegating downward to say line of business 1 and line of business 2. You can put whatever you want in the portal, and it'll show up here, and I'll have some sort of combined presentation or combined control of what gets presented. So, and there's a lot of other ways to talk about it, but I'll just leave it at that. That just federation always involves some form of delegation, where somebody else allows somebody else to do whatever they want within the scope of delegation.
Right. It's sort of like a supermarket where the vendors come in and pack their own shelves, but it takes it to the next level as well, where you actually, when you check out, you actually give the vendor that money directly as well. So, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
so
it could be something like that. Yeah.
So this might be a good question for you, Randy. From a product management perspective, who owns the APIs? Is it a business function or a technology team?
So here what you have to do is get down into the taxonomy to say, well, what kind of API are we talking about? So the product manager, though, is a whole new sort of concept to talk about in the API days versus the SOA days, where we really didn't talk about it. Product manager would have meant something much lower, much less, in terms of scope. But I mean, so it's probably best just to give some examples. So if I'm Twilio and I'm selling telecom products through an API, then each of my products will have its own product manager, and here we're using the term product manager in very much the traditional sense of a product manager at any manufacturing firm and the like. If I'm talking about enterprise APIs, internal agility kinds of APIs, then maybe I have a product manager who is really more of a process owner, and they own the APIs for the API, the business units of work that apply within our order fulfillment process or something like that. If I'm doing an open web strategy and I'm Chicago Transit Authority or somebody, then there would be a product manager who would be thinking about how do I encourage a developer community to do lots of interesting things so that the public will see much more of, and you get much more value out of our transit services and make it much easier to use our transit services. So it has a different scope, different notion. And so in a couple of these cases, it was business people. It could be, if we look down into an integration scenario where the APIs are for integrating into some legacy application that are then brought together through orchestration or whatever into some broader context, one of these other contexts, then maybe the product manager for the APIs to integrate into that application is an IT application owner. So any of these, kind of goes different ways, but it's the questions are, what's the scope of the API? Who's the audience? and what kind of mindset and business skills are needed in order to make sure that the APIs are meeting the needs of the audience in accordance with the business scenario.
Right. Another question is, how does ESB differ from API gateway? This is a good question, a question we get a lot of. So ESBs and API gateways is a blurry line there. An API gateway has typically emerged as, or come from a legacy of something that you would deploy into the DMZ. An ESB has typically been something that provides orchestration internally. But what we've found over time is that the API gateway is slowly eating away at the ESB functionality. And when it comes to things like API orchestration, the API gateway is starting to do more and more of what that ESB traditionally did. The API gateway is taking an approach that's lighter weight, that's JSON-based, it's non-persistent, it's non-transactional. So those are the kinds of things that are the domain of the API gateway: non-persistent, non-transactional API aggregations and orchestrations. The ESB typically deals with adapters and connectors into legacy systems. They are behind the firewall on the intranet. They are doing complex orchestrations and wrapping up long-running business logic kinds of transactions. The issue that we found is that the product manager, as Randy sort of described, that person is dealing with the life cycle and the delivery of the API. And they are trying to find a platform that they can deliver this API with. The organizations that are owning that own the ESB are responsible for delivering a different kind of API at a different rate of change and with a different SDLC. So there's needs at different points in this layered strategy to be able to orchestrate and mediate. And I think that at some point, deep down within the organization, behind the firewall, on the internet, connecting to legacy systems, there's a set of APIs there that the ESB can fulfill. But as you get out to the consumer-facing side of the APIs and to the mobile APIs, that's where the gateway does very, very well, where you're dealing with the high rate of change, very agile kinds of APIs that you're trying to put out into the market, and you need a lighter weight way of doing that orchestration and aggregation.
And the one thing I would add is you have to have you have to be very careful where in all of that, whether it's API gateway or ESB or something underneath, that you have to be very careful of that you don't lose track of where your business logic is implemented versus and so semantic rules versus syntactic rules, things that take that basically reformat, combine, take apart, filter. These are syntactic kinds of rules, largely, not entirely. But if your business rules are sort of spread across a number of different places, it's easy to lose track of where they are. So you have to be careful of that in your architecture.
Yeah. You would want your business logic to be resident in your ESB and keep as little business logic as possible in your gateway.
Yeah.
Another question for you, Randy. How is API really driving digital innovation?
So in lots of ways, and also, and it's sort of a question like saying how useful are nuts and bolts? Lots and lots of ways. But so digital, one aspect of digital transformation people often think of.
I think we might have lost Randy.
I think we lost Randy. So sorry, but I'm going to give him 1 minute to get back in. Otherwise, maybe
well, we can answer another question, and when he rejoins, we can push from there.
Okay.
So let's see. Should an API portal provide metrics and reports on usage, errors, benefits, etc.? Yes, absolutely. It does depend on the API portal is typically divided into administration interface and presentation interface. So an API portal needs to provide the administration and the reporting for usage, errors, etc., 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 for the people who are providing the API. Conversely, in terms of the presentation and the marketing side, it needs to give developers visibility into the API. So if, for example, if you have a test client and you send a request, you need to see the request and response on the wire. You also need to present to that developer perhaps reports on how the API or how the application is performing. So you do need to be careful about the metrics and the reporting and make sure that it's relevant to the audience. In terms of benefits, etc., that's more marketing, and that's part of the calls to action you're going to put into place. So one of the most important things about putting together an API portal is figuring out what is the product marketing that needs to happen. So going back to Randy's comments about a product manager in a very literal sense, you have to have a product manager that designs these APIs and figures out what the value is to the market and figures out what the marketing activities and branding activities are around that. So yes, you need a portal so that you can actually convey that message to the consumers of the API appropriately, whether it be internal or B2B or external. Another question is, how does a layered API approach differ from a SOA approach? It's not that different. In my mind, API and SOA are very, very synonymous. There's a lot of different technologies and definitely a shift in terms of the ownership and the focus. But in many respects, APIs is fulfilling an original promise of SOA that got very bogged down in integration versus a sort of a business approach to APIs. So I don't believe that a layered API approach is that different from SOA. I think that the difference is that at each level, those APIs, at each layer, that API is fundamentally a product. And when I talk about the big difference between APIs and SOA, I talk about shifting the center of gravity. An API is something that is published as a product and then consumed. That's what a service was supposed to be. But what ended up happening was SOA got so consumed with the banalities of standards and those kinds of things, and it turned into an integration standard rather than a product mechanism. So people built services for a particular purpose instead of thinking about how a service can meet the needs of multiple consumers. And an API has turned out to be much, much better at that. Maybe it's just a change in people's mentalities or attitudes, but an API is far more designed as a product. So you'll put it out there, and people will consume it, and they will design their applications in such a way that they can consume it. Instead of the other way around, where you had to design a service specific to an application and you had a proliferation of services. So I think that fundamentally, idealistically, an API and SOA are the same. But in terms of its implementation and its acceptance and how it's being rolled out, it's a bit different. Randy, I don't know if you've rejoined. I'll take that as a no. All right. Let's see what other questions we have here. We're almost done with time. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just scrolled in the wrong direction here. How does API management fit into a larger digital transformation initiative, and how can I make a business case for it? This is a good point, because this is one of the fundamental differences between APIs and SOA. SOA, because it was around integration, became an argument for reuse. And if you're going out to the business and saying, I'm going to save money for reuse, the immediate problem is that it takes a really long time to realize those benefits. So SOA was hard to do and hard to see a return on investment. APIs, however, are subtly different. APIs are an effect of a current trend. You have to build APIs, and you are building APIs today to meet the needs of your mobile devices, to meet the needs of your different web applications. So APIs are happening today already. The goal here is to leverage your API as a product and try and create new business strategies. So how can you publish an API that is going to make the business money? So the business case for an API is not around cost saving, which it was for SOA, but it's around how do you create new channels for revenue. And that really allows you to focus at least your public and B2B API strategies, very tightly around a new business initiative. And if you can come up with a business initiative that just happens to use APIs, then that is much, much easier to get funding for than, some, very technical propeller head kind of cost savings or pie in the sky approach. If you can come up with a direct business benefit or a way that you can make money or a way that you can defend yourself against competition, that's a business conversation that is much, much easier to tie to revenue or to money in some way for your management. All right, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. I don't know if Randy's rejoined us, but
I think Randy was not able to get back in, so thank you very much, everybody, for being with us today. We're going to be sending out a link to a recording of this webinar and a link to the PowerPoint deck in a couple of days. If other questions, please feel free to email us at info@akana.com, and we will get back to you. So thank you so much.